Hey everyone, welcome back to here in Apologetics. Super pumped you're joining us today. Today I have John, the godless engineer. We're just going to talk about like God and the nature of evidence. So John, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. Just, grinding it out at work and on YouTube and stuff. So, just busy, busy, busy.
Yep, as we all are. So yeah, I'm super pumped for today. We're going to talk about like God and looking at like the nature of like what is evidence and like could we say like what would be evidence for God or what could be evidence against God and kind of hashing out those views. So I think just at the beginning, I'll kind of like give like my kind of goals or like general thoughts for this conversation. And like one of my major goals and like what I come away hoping with is we can kind of get away with that from the idea that like there's no evidence for either side. Like I've heard it on, either side. And I've been guilty of saying this, like as a Christian, I used to say there is no evidence against God's existence. And like over the past like few months and really probably about a year, I've kind of really shifted away from that and said like there's evidence on both sides. And I'd hope to see us as a community, Christians and atheists, kind of progress to saying there is some evidence on both sides. And obviously, it hashes out differently how we see it. But that's kind of my major goal from this conversation, John. And I'm sure you may disagree with me, but I just kind of want to lay that out front. And like that's kind of what I'm thinking as we progress through this.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds like a good plan.
Awesome. So I think it'd be helpful then to talk about like the nature of evidence. So in your mind, then, John, what is evidence?
Well, for me, evidence would be some kind of, I guess, either empirical information or just something that's directly observed that we know to be to happen in reality or to be true. And then but under this particular connotation, that evidence has to support the conclusion that you're coming to, whether that's this evidence is taken with other pieces of evidence to support the conclusion. I think that in order for it to be considered good evidence, it has to support the conclusion that you're coming to.
Okay. So I'd be curious then maybe to talk about like, so would you say that evidence has to be empirical, John, or would you allow for like other forms of evidence? So for example, like I would say there's no like observable evidence that like other minds exist. Like I can't like put you in a test tube and like see your conscious experience. Obviously, like you could physicalism could still be true under that kind of model of things, but I just said like you can't access someone else's consciousness. So there would be that doorway to like other kinds. But where would you fall on that idea?
Well, I mean, I think that the evidence has to exist in reality. And one of those ways that we know that it does is through empirical evidence. I think that like the whole solipsism or hard solipsism, I don't really think that really advances the conversation. I feel like that particular route is kind of moot, because regardless of whether or not we can prove that other minds exist, we're still presented with this reality. So I feel like the evidence has to exist like within reality, some kind of in some kind of observable way, in order for you to say that it is evidence.
So, okay, so I would agree with you on. So, one point I think I agree with you on is like evidence has to exist in reality. Like, so for example, like if I make the claim that like God exists, but God doesn't actually exist in reality, then that claim is false. And you can say the same thing with like other things that require evidence. But where I'm still kind of like wondering as we think about this is this idea of like, so I don't like to like advertise solipsism. Like I think you're a human being. So, but I think it's helpful because we think about things. And I think for me, I have a hard time like adhering to only empirical things being like considered evidence. And I'm not trying to say that that's necessarily what you believe, but like for me, like when we look at like other minds, like there's no like neuroscientific study that we can do to like access your consciousness. Like I was talking to a friend of mine at a conference who's doing his PhD in neuroscience, and he talked about how like we have this good mapping of the brain, but with regards to consciousness, and I'm not even trying to bring forth an argument from consciousness here because I think there's like not non-theistic versions that like agree that like consciousness isn't accessible in an experiment. But what I'm just trying to say is like we have other forms of data beyond like merely empirical things, such as like our conscious experience that can't be like tested beyond our own like minds.
Well, I mean, are you kind of getting into the more, I guess, philosophical kind of evidence where it's more or less like logical argumentation that entails some statement is true. Is that what you're talking about?
Not necessarily. So here's what I'm trying to get at. So if you think of evidence as like some facts about the world, something that exists in reality that supports your proposition. So we look at everything that's true, everything that exists. Those are facts regarding like maybe like minds or like evolution or microphones or things like that. I would say that there's some of those facts aren't like empirical facts, something that's like physical that you can go look at under a microscope. And I would say that consciousness isn't one of those facts that exists, but it's not like an empirical fact. So we have things like beyond like the mere hard sciences that exist that we have to like account for when thinking about evidence.
Well, I mean, as far as consciousness goes, I think that there are several pieces of evidence that you could bring up that
Mhm.
would logically conclude that at least another a conscious exists. Like, you can do brain scans and you can do various tests on the brains that would give the indication of a consciousness existing. So I think that there are empirical ways that you can get to the most likely conclusion of other consciousnesses exist. But
Mhm.
I mean, I guess to try to bridge the what we're talking about here, I feel like if something does exist, then it has to exist within reality. And the
Mhm.
only thing that we know about this reality is the physical nature of reality. Like, you might say materialism, like the material world is all that we know to exist. And I feel like that's a true statement because, we can't prove things that are outside of reality. We don't have any way to demonstrably prove those things. Generally, you have to just, I guess, sort of assume that there is something outside of this reality in order to I guess meddle around with that kind of idea. But I feel like if there's if anything does exist, then as far as our universe and our reality goes, then it has to exist within our reality. And for us to know it, we have to be able to like either observe or at least observe the effects of that particular thing.
Okay, so you said one thing about brain scans, and I totally agree with you. Like brain scans are evidence like that, like consciousness exists. So I totally agree on that. So I want to emphasize that with you. But then like just going back to that, I would say that like sure that like brain scans exist, but that's not the whole story. And like sure you'd agree that like you aren't just merely your brain scans. Like there is something more to you, like which is your consciousness. This is compatible with like naturalistic theories of the mind, like panpsychism, where there's something more to consciousness than just like the brain scans, so to speak. So that then I would say again, like when we're looking at like the nature of evidence, then there is some like reason to think that like not all the data when we're thinking about evidence is just going to be like merely like physical things.
Well, right, but that's why I didn't say that like our consciousness are completely contained within brain scans. I'm just saying that like we can't measure consciousness, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
in an empirical way, or at least I'm not a neuroscientist or anything
Me
like that. So
either.
this is totally outside of my expertise.
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
uh, and so I don't know if there's a way that we can quantify uh, consciousness in any kind of way. But what I'm saying is that I do know that there are ways that we can quantify physically these different aspects of what it means to have a consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can use that to come to the most likely conclusion that a consciousness exists. And I feel like you can use this, especially in the coming age of like artificial intelligence and everything like that. Blade Runner is a pretty good example because in the movie Blade Runner, Harrison Ford's character, his primary like job is to root out who's a robot and who isn't. And so he runs through all these tests, right? But the tests are meant to determine whether or not like there's an actual like consciousness in somebody, or if it's just like programming or whatever. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that's what I'm talking about here are these different tests that you could run on the physical medium of this reality and determine whether or not something has a consciousness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'm tracking with you, and I think we're getting closer to progress here. Because I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying here. Like, we have this idea of like there being like these physical things like brain scans and physical processes, and from these we can try to conclude that like things like consciousness exists. And to me, that seems like we're using like our data, our evidence, looking at like physical things, and we're concluding that something exists as a result of the data, of the evidence, like brain scans exist, and that'd be consciousness. This isn't something like you talked about, like things like being measurable. Like our brain scans are measurable, or like if you do like a like a rocket experiment, it's measurable. But consciousness isn't measurable. So it seems like to me, like I think I'm tracking with you because we have this idea of there being able to use like physical processes and like empirical evidence and making conclusions that aren't necessarily things that are like detectable by like a purely scientific process. They're kind of inferred based off of like here's the best explanation given these things like brain scans. So does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Yeah, to draw another comparison to like indirect, because what we're talking about now is indirect evidence of something,
Mhm.
right? And another good example of that would be a black holes. Like, we can't see black holes,
Mhm.
but what we can do is measure the effects of black holes, like on their surrounding area of where they're at, and that's how we can theoretically see black holes. And so and to sort of transpose this to the theistic or the theism discussion, or religious discussion, I feel like if God were to exist, then we could measure the effects of God in reality, because everybody says, or at least every religious person that I've come in contact with, and I've seen in written literature, says that God has an effect on this reality. In
Mhm.
much the same way as consciousness and black holes, I feel like we should be able to detect God's effect on this reality, even if we can't necessarily quantify like God as a being, or as an entity in general. Even though we can't quantify him in that way, I think that, or them, or whoever, in that way, I think that we should be able to measure the effects that that entity has on this reality, if at all.
I think I totally agree with you. Like there wasn't much that you said, if anything, John, that I disagree with you on. Maybe we're gonna disagree on like what those effects should be. But in terms of like thinking like if God exists, well, there should be some effects that would like kind of like show that He would exist. And I think I agree with you on that. Well, I definitely agree with you on that because like the way I kind of like argue for God is similar to like a Swinburnian approach, where Swinburne uses a lot of like scientific explanations of saying like looking at the effects. So is there anything else you want to say on the nature of evidence, or maybe we could talk about like what that would look like for like the existence of God?
Yeah, I mean, we can move on to that aspect of it, if you want to. I don't really have much else to say about like what is evidence, other than it's some information that you can use to prove your conclusion, and that in order for it to be good evidence, it has to, one, support your conclusion, but two, it also has to sort of exist within reality. You can't just make up some piece of evidence and say that it proves your conclusion. If it doesn't exist in some kind of fashion, then I think that uh, I think that you don't really have that evidence. I mean, you have this idea of what a good piece of evidence is, but you don't have the evidence.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you on the definition of evidence. Like I had in our notes that I sent you before, like I think of evidence as something that makes a proposition more likely to be true. So like if we take the
Hmm.
example, like the case of brain scans would be expected if like there are conscious minds that exist in like an embodied form. Um, whereas if they didn't exist, it'd probably be like, very unlikely that like conscious life would exist or anything like that. So we could say that like brain scans are some evidence for consciousness. Obviously like you could try to like explain away the data, and like you and I would both agree like maybe like the young earth creationist has some sort of explanation to try to explain things like the fossil record, but it's really not a good explanation. Is something that we probably both agree on, unless you're secretly like a young earth creationist, John. But
No, definitely not.
so like I think we agree there. Like evidence is something that makes a proposition more likely to be true. That's in the data that you're using to draw your evidence from has to be something that actually exists in the world. It can't be something that you just make up. So I think we're on the same page.
Okay,
Okay,
good.
so I'm curious then, how would you go about saying like what would be evidence for God? So for example, like I would say like something like the existence of moral conscious agents, people like you and me who can think and make decisions and have relationships with each other, and God, if he exists, would be more likely if God does exist than if God does not exist. So since that data exists, like we exist, and it's more expected on like theism than atheism, and I'm using like hard atheism, like if you were to say there is no God, there'd be some evidence for theism. And I'm sure you disagree, but how would you go about saying about like there'd be some evidence for God?
Well, I mean, I really don't know what that evidence would be, obviously I disagree with the moral argument, as
Mhm.
being evidence for God. I understand how you come to see it as evidence for God, but that's where I get I get a little bit nuanced in what I say, because I generally say there's no good evidence for God,
Mhm.
and that's kind of how I differentiate it. But as far as like what would evidence for God be, you would need to be able to prove, direct causation of some phenomena, uh like prior to knowing how the water cycle worked. We had this notion that God caused it to rain, God caused it to snow, hail, thunder, lightning. All of those things were because of God. And if you could somehow prove that some phenomena, like rain or something that happened in this reality, could just absolutely not have happened unless God intervened in this reality and did something, then I think that you would have good evidence for God if you could prove that. But that's a pretty, I mean, that's a pretty hard thing to prove in general.
Mhm. I think so. I think there's two distinctions here we need to make out. One is like good evidence versus evidence. So like I'd be willing to say like maybe there is no good evidence. Well, I would totally disagree. But like I'm fine for the sake of this conversation that like you saying there's no good evidence for God. But then the question still remains like, is there evidence for God in the first place? Like maybe is there anything that would say raise it from like probability 0 to like 0.0001 or something like that? I'd
Well,
be curious, like what would you say on that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the principles that I usually use whenever I'm trying to determine like the most likely conclusion or most likely answer to any kind of question is to never pick zero.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I wouldn't start off with zero. I think that there is like a small chance that a God could exist, but
Mhm.
we would just need like substantially strong evidence in order to say that he does exist. And so something that would raise um something that would raise the likelihood of God existing would just be any kind of direct correlation. I don't know how else to describe it other than
Mhm.
just a direct correlation between this idea of an entity that exists, I guess, outside of the universe, and he's the only reason why this particular phenomena happened, and that that's the only explanation that makes sense, is that this phenomena happened. But that's a very generalized look at it, and it's a lot more complicated than it sounds, because you essentially what you got to do is rule out every other explanation, and sometimes that's nearly impossible to do.
Mhm.
And so you would just it would need to be some event like that where you could rule out every other possibility, and then you could prove, or then you would have good evidence to say that, well, God did that.
So I think there's some points I agree with you on. So like if you look at like say like Craig, like William Lane Craig's general apologetics, he tries to do kind of like what you're describing. So for example, his fine tuning argument, he tries to say that like fine tuning design is the only possible explanation for fine tuning, assuming there is fine tuning in the first place. And I'm not a fan of that kind of like approach because like I think there's like reasonable options that like the atheist or naturalist could hold to, like maybe saying it's necessary. Doesn't mean it's a good explanation, but you can't just like rule it out a priori or really without argumentation. So I prefer to like a fine tuning argument where we just say like design is more likely if God exists. So maybe I'd be curious then, John, like, would you say that there is evidence for God? I know you don't think there's good evidence, but would you say that there's any evidence in the first place?
Well, I do believe that there are things that people use for evidence for God, and I think that as stated, that it's evidence, but it's I don't think that that evidence actually supports the conclusion. And so generally I'm very reactive in nature when it comes to like even a general theistic type of God. um
Mhm.
I'm very reactive in nature. So like if somebody brings a piece of evidence to me and says, aha, this proves God, and then I take a look at the evidence, and I in my own like subjective conclusion of the evidence, it does not support that conclusion. So that doesn't mean that it's necessarily not evidence. It's just not good evidence that supports the conclusion. And
Mhm.
so I think that a lot of people kind of go maybe not too far. Like I think that they just go a little bit further than they should with the there's no evidence for God, because obviously there are things that people consider to be evidence for God, and on its face, like for instance the Kalam cosmological argument, on its
Mhm.
face it's presented as evidence for God. Now whether or not that evidence proves the conclusion is a totally different question. And so I don't know. I feel like I kind of went roundabout with answering your question, but maybe there was something coherent in that.
Yeah, no, I think I'm tracking. There's a couple threads, and obviously, like it's a very complex topic, so you can't just like go through all of it in just like 20 minutes here and have all the answers. But I mean, it seems like to me like we both agree that like there is evidence for God, even though you would say it's not good evidence. Am I right there? Am I tracking you?
Well, yeah, and more specifically, it's not good evidence, and it doesn't support the conclusion. Is how I would specifically word it.
Mhm. Well, what do you mean by doesn't support this conclusion? Because it seems like to me, like if the evidence isn't expected on the conclusion, or more, it's more likely than not, looking at like its competitors, then like it wouldn't be evident. So like thinking about like young Earth creationism again, like the fossil record seems super unexpected on young Earth creationism, whereas on maybe like a theory where the Earth is a lot older, the fossil record is probably something like what we'd expect. So then like that would be evidence that supports the conclusion that like the Earth isn't 6,000 years old. So it seems like to me that'd be evidence. So I'm confused what you mean by like evidence that wouldn't support the conclusion.
Well, so it's when you so how you determine whether or not a piece of evidence support the conclusion that somebody's coming to is you got to take a look at like the different pieces of the evidence. So let's take your young Earth creationism thing. Like the fossil record is more like, if I let me know if I got this wrong, but the
Mm-hmm.
fossil record is more likely on the assumption of an intelligent designer than on no intelligent designer. Is that the what you said?
The fossil record?
Yeah.
No, I would say so. I'm thinking about like for like an argument against young Earth creationism. It's like the fossil
Mhm.
record is more expected if the Earth is old than if the Earth is like just 6,000 years old. That was kind of what I'm getting at. So there'd be some evidence that
Oh,
the Earth isn't 6,000 years old.
Oh, well, I mean, yes, obviously yes, the fossil record is definitely evidence against the Earth being old. And
Mm-hmm.
with that, I mean, like just taking that argument right there, you would have to look at, well, what does it what does the fossil record mean? Like what is the fossil record? And then you go into that and you figure out how fossilization works and how that takes millions and millions of years.
Mm-hmm.
You figure out the geologic column and how that was laid down over millions and millions of years. You take a look at the positions of the different fossils in the geologic column, and you realize that there's no way that like a flood destroyed everything and created all these
Mm-hmm.
fossils. So I mean, you can see how the fossil record and everything that encapsulates it is good evidence that says the Earth is older than 6,000 years. Um, And so you would want to take a look at the individual aspects of whatever argument that you're using. Let's take the moral argument for or not sorry not moral argument. Let's take the design argument, like you were saying that
Mm-hmm.
that the universe being designed is more likely if an intelligent designer exists. Did I capture that right? How
Yeah,
you
that's
argue it?
right. That's how I'd
Okay.
say it's more likely if God exists than if God does not exist.
Well, the way that I would look at that is I would first look at the claim that, the universe is designed. And it kind of seems like there's just a presumption there that we find design in nature. And, um,
Can I interrupt for a second, John, if you don't mind?
yeah, yeah, sure.
Okay, I just don't like interrupting, so I wanted to make sure. But I would just to refine it. I wouldn't even make that that inference that it's designed. I would say just the existence of moral conscious agents. So like people like you and me, the existence of like human
Okay.
beings is more likely on theism than atheism. So that way I don't smuggle in design because that can carry a lot of baggage when looking at
Okay.
this.
Well, okay. Well, yeah. I mean, we could do the moral and the consciousness aspect of it too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, like, as far as looking at this moral argument that uh, moral and conscious creatures are more likely if an intelligent designer exists, but the problem is that I don't see any direct connection between morality and God. Earlier I was talking about how you would have to rule out every other possibility, and the problem is that morality, a moral sense, seems to be an emergent property of complex nervous systems. That's
Mm-hmm.
the reason why we see multiple different animals, other animals in the animal kingdom, exhibit some sense of like a moral foundation. Like, you've all seen the cute puppy videos and the of course there's the other apes out there that also show a sense at times of morality, and there's also in those respective categories um, examples of extreme cruelty,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like that's all congruent with like human behavior and this idea that you know morality is just an emergent property of a human brain. What you would need to do is you would need to prove that the only way for somebody to have any kind of moral knowledge is because this intelligent designer or intelligent creator or whatever being exists. And it's a really hard bar to overcome, but that's you would need to connect those two. And currently, right now, I don't see that connection. And so that's how I would kind of, I guess, analyze that. It's totally subjective.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I'm perfectly fine with that, with it being subjective, because it's very obvious that the moral argument does convince people that God exists, and so they
Mm-hmm.
consider that to be evidence. And I'm not going to sit here and tell people, well, that's not evidence, like just in general. I would say that's not evidence of God. That's how I would phrase that. Not denying that argument as being evidence in general, just that it doesn't support the conclusion that you come to with it.
So I think there's a few things that like I could agree with you on. So one of them is the idea that like obviously like our conclusions are going to be somewhat subjective. So I think like Peter Van Inwagen, who was an atheist professor and eventually he became a Christian, talked about how like when he was at like his crossroads, he was like, in one sense, I could see the world as like ordered and designed by like a rational mind behind it, and on the other end, I could also see like there being no God behind everything, reflecting on like suffering. And he generally was like really like 50-50 almost on it. Like he could see it both ways. So I think that like, like you and I look at the world from like completely different perspective. Well, not completely, but like at least in the context of like God existing or God not existing, in different perspectives. So here's where I think like the definition of evidence that I brought forth in the beginning, and I think you agree to it or something similar to it, where I'd say it's
Yeah.
something that makes a proposition more likely to be true. I think this is helpful here because I think that like when we're looking at like moral conscious agents, like that definition, and saying that like it's evidence for God allows that like there's possible like evolutionary explanations for like the existence of like our ability to like make moral decisions, and be conscious and things like that. It just says that this mechanism, like whatever that created us, when we look at the conclusion and thinking of like all the ways the world could have been if God exists, it's more likely that we'd like we'd exist in this way than if God does not exist. So that's kind of where I get be at, is like, because when you're talking about like these different mechanisms, I was like, yes, 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 I agree with you. Like that's definitely a possible explanation for these things. But I'm just thinking about like, is it more expected on theism or is it more expected on atheism? Is kind of what I'm trying to get at.
Well, I guess the whole being more expected on theism than atheism. I mean, with morality and consciousness and everything like that, for all that we can really determine, those are natural properties of complex nervous systems. I don't see how it's more likely on theism than atheism. I don't understand what tips it in the direction of theism.
Mm-hmm.
uh, because, like, for instance, rain would not be proof of God, right?
Mm-hmm. I
We
agree
can
with you.
agree with that, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Uh, rain, and I'm just using this as a very basic example. There's a natural process for rain, the water cycle, and so we understand how that works and how it doesn't require God in order for it to rain or for the water cycle to operate, because it's just a natural process. In much the same way, I see our moral knowledge and our consciousness as being just another natural process that doesn't require a intelligent being in order for it to be there. So
Mm-hmm.
I would what I would need is to consider it like to be like a to consider the moral argument to be a proposition to make a God more likely true. Would I would need to know, like, how, like, why is it that God is required for natural processes to
Mm-hmm.
happen? Like, why is God there? Because what I end up usually getting from people is just this presumption that God is required for natural processes, instead of connecting those dots, instead of saying, well, natural processes couldn't happen unless God did this, or this is the evidence that
Mm-hmm.
God causes natural processes to happen.
Yeah. Okay. So going back to the beginning, are you fine with like my definition of evidence? Like it's just evidence is something that makes a proposition more likely to be true.
I mean, I do agree with it, but I think that where generally the disagreement comes in is whether or not the proposition makes it more likely to be true.
Okay. So going back again to our, like we talked at the beginning, at like brain scans or evidence for like consciousness, like the existence of consciousness. Like we have, as of now, we have no like lab test or something like that that can show consciousness exists. But we do have brain scans, which seem to indicate that there is like the existence of consciousness. And these brain scans, this is our data that we know about. This is like more expected if consciousness exists than if consciousness does not exist. We're on the same page there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I would say then is we could use that same similar argument with like moral conscious agents. And what I didn't do is explain like why would we expect this if God exists. So you're right to bring up that point as we were talking. And what I would say is that like if we think of God as a perfect being, I'm gonna put that as my definition of God. If he's gonna create, he'd create good things. And surely we'd say that like our existence is good. So there'd be so if God was great, we'd have some evidence that like something good would exist, such as us. Whereas if we reflect on atheism, and I'm using hard atheism again, if we think about like what God does not exist, what would we expect the world to look like if God does not exist? And I think we're left saying, well, we just don't know because the foundation is indifferent. Maybe there'd be nothing. Maybe there'd be some sort of evolutionary process that allows for like things like you and I to exist today. Maybe there's like 10 molecules. Maybe there's 10 million. We just really don't know. Whereas if God exists, we'd have some inclination that there would be like a creation of good things in existence. So by that, I would say, okay, well, we have a little bit more reason. I'd say a lot, but like for the sake of this argument, I can say just a little bit more reason to think we would exist if God exists. And this allows like
Okay.
God creating through some sort of like evolutionary process or something like that.
Okay. So, uh, sorry, my glucose alarm is going off. No, it's going high. So we can both agree that, like, we can both agree that on atheism or on theism, the water cycle is just as likely on both, right?
I wouldn't say just as likely. I would say that both can explain them. So that's what I would say.
Well,
'Cause
so how I laid it out earlier was that, the water cycle is a natural process,
mhm,
and that in natural processes don't require, as far as we know, God's intervention in order for those processes to work. So maybe you can explain to me, that, on the idea that God definitely doesn't exist versus the idea that God does exist. I don't see how rain would be more likely on either position, considering that natural processes don't require a God.
mhm.
So it to me it seems more logical to say that, well, that's neutral evidence. Like that's not really evidence for the conclusion that you're coming to of which one's more likely. It just
Mhm.
seems moot, if you will.
Yeah. So I think for me, where it comes down to what it entails. So, for example, like if I'm right, like God would have some reason to create conscious life, he'd probably need some sort of like ecosystem to support them. And that may involve a water cycle, which is why I'd say, well, maybe a water cycle is more expected if God exists because it's going to allow for an environment, which is going to allow for like moral conscious agents to exist. I think I do agree with you though. Like if we're taking something like that's totally random that has like no moral significance, like say like stardust, maybe that would be like indifferent and not support like either position, like the existence of stardust, if it has no relevance to like anything outside of itself. If you track what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, I get what you're saying, and I get that you can explain why the water cycle would exist, given an intelligent design, not designer, but an intelligent creator.
Mm-hmm.
I get that you can kind of explain that, but I guess what I was getting at was that it doesn't require God,
Mm-hmm.
so that
I agree with
means
you.
that, yeah, so that means that it's no more expected on atheism than it is on theism. I mean, both, like just like you can come up with an explanation for why God would create the water cycle, I can
Mm-hmm.
come up with a reasonable explanation through the different physics that goes on with the water cycle and everything like that, why the water cycle happens without God. So
Mm-hmm.
we're still kind of at an impasse with the 50-50 split on, water being more likely on either worldview. Do you see where I'm headed with that?
Yeah, I think I'm tracking with you. So, like, if we go back to our example of like young Earth creationism in the fossil record, so if we're gonna say sure, the young Earth creationists could have some sort of explanation, from maybe adding a bunch of different like auxiliary hypotheses or something to explain like why we have a fossil record the way we do. But it's not going to be a good explanation, even if they could explain all the data. Like you and I would agree, like that's not a good explanation. A better explanation is just the Earth isn't 6,000 years old. Um, so in the same way, I would say like like you could have your explanation for why like conscious life exists, from an atheistic worldview. I just think that like theism is still that better explanation. So there'd be some like reason to move towards thinking that God exists, even if it's not like a significant reason. So that's what I try to get at, like trying to think about like saying there's evidence for God.
Okay.
Okay, so I mean, I think so. We've talked about like what is evidence, something that makes a proposition more likely to be true, and you would have a little bit of reservation, and but you'd say something similar. And then we've said that like we it seems like we both agree like that there is some evidence for God, even if it's not good. You would not say that it's not there's no good evidence for God, but would you agree like there's evidence for God? Is
I would agree that there are multiple pieces of evidence that people use to prove God and use for God. So I mean, I would agree with that.
okay. So I still want to say like, oh, John says there's evidence for God when he doesn't. That's what I'm trying to avoid because I really hate when you misrepresent other people. So if I say John says there's evidence for God, am I wrong or am I right when I say that?
Well, I mean it's a lot more, it's a bit more involved than that. So
Mhm,
like that's why I generally never say that there is or isn't evidence for God.
mhm,
Um, I generally say there's no good evidence for God.
mhm,
And my position on it is kind of complicated and hard to encapsulate in like one sentence, because it's like I agree that people use certain things as evidence. I don't consider them to be evidence that proves their conclusion.
I
So
agree with
that
you.
doesn't mean that it's not evidence of something. It just means that that evidence isn't doesn't prove the conclusion that like God exists.
Mhm.
And so I would say an accurate sentence would be that there is evidence that people use for God.
Okay. Well, I would agree, like, that there's evidence that people use for young Earth creationism. I would just say it's not good evidence. So I think maybe we're on a similar track there.
Mhm.
So maybe we could be helpful to talk about, like, saying that like there's evidence against God. That might be helpful to talk about in this last bit.
I'm sure.
So I think so for me, like I would say there's no good evidence against God's existence, but I would say well, it depends on how you phrase it. But I would say there's evidence against God's existence, even if it's not good. So for example, like reflecting today as I was driving to work, I was thinking about animal suffering for whatever reason. I was driving, and I was like, what if I just run over like a cat right now and it suffers and dies? Like that would be terrible. And I was thinking, I'm like, well, if God exists, like why is there a world like this? Whereas if like God doesn't exist, well, it seems like possible, like, well, it's just the way it is. So maybe there'd be like some evidence against God's existence. But then you have to build into that idea, like, well, there's the idea of like this whole like structure with conscious life in the first place, and maybe that would weigh in favor of theism. But broadly speaking, I would say like the existence of like gratuitous sufferings, like say like a person running over an animal and it suffering and dying, is more expected on God not existing than God existing, assuming one important thing that like conscious life exists in the first place. Not getting into like which view of the world better explains the data. So maybe you're tracking with what I'm saying. Maybe I'm just rambling. So I don't know what you're thinking, John.
Well, I mean, it this is where the nuance of God comes in because
Mm-hmm.
it depends on what you mean by God.
So let's think of God just
It
as like a perfect being. Maybe if that's helpful for this dialogue,
well,
or
I
maybe
don't
it's
know
not.
because I don't know what a perfect being like would be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that perfect being is a lot more specific than general theism.
Mm-hmm.
And like because I can only think of like specific definitions of God that describe him as a perfect being.
Okay, so maybe we should
Um,
think about it as like so I think what I used when we debated way back when 18 gazillion years ago was like a mind that created the universe is what I said. So
mhm.
maybe that would be more helpful.
Well, as far as that goes, I really don't think that animal suffering is a good argument against like God existing. I think that it's a good argument against like the Christian God or any God that is said to be omnibenevolent.
Hmm.
Um, I think or you know I guess really just omnibenevolent would be the only characteristic that I would think of that would preclude him from allowing that kind of gratuitous suffering
Hmm. Let's
from
say
happening.
God is omnibenevolent because like that's what at least I believe.
Right.
So
That's generally, I mean, generally in these kind of conversations, you're talking about an omnibenevolent God. And
hmm.
so, like, gratuitous suffering would be a good piece of evidence against that God existing because I don't understand how you could be omnibenevolent and allow the suffering to happen. Like, I feel like if you're omnibenevolent, you would definitely figure out a way to accomplish whatever goal without the gratuitous suffering, because if you're omnibenevolent, you don't want that to happen. And
Hmm.
I know that a lot of apologists will get around that by just saying, oh well, you know, according to the Bible, Eve ate the apple and therefore we're really responsible for all of the sin and death and suffering in the world.
Hmm.
And that's kind of the Christian view of it. I don't know if you would argue it that way, but a lot of times people do. And
Hmm.
that still like presumes like the truth of the Christian God in order to make that work. And still, though, I think that even given that explanation, I would think that God, being this omnibenevolent being, would still try to figure out a way to not a to not allow this gratuitous suffering to exist. So
Hmm.
all this is getting around to, for an omnibenevolent God, gratuitous suffering would be an argument against it or evidence against it.
Would you be fine if in like 5 minutes we go to maybe some questions? Because I know there's a good bit of people
Oh
watching.
yeah,
maybe
I've seen a few people come in with some good questions. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'll try to go back, but if you can now, if you have a question, guys, put it in the chat right now. Put like a Q or something next to it, and we'll try to get through a few of those in like 5 minutes or so. So put those in, and we'll see what we can do. But I'll just respond to that briefly. So I think I'd agree with a lot of it. So like for example, like the existence of gratuitous suffering, like we have like Christians have like theodicies and defenses we could point to, and like I wouldn't say merely the fall. Like I think I read a good book by John Schneider, who's a Christian theologian. And he talked about like why the fall isn't enough to really explain animal suffering, because God foresaw the fall, at least under like Christian theology. So he knew that this was going to happen. So you can't just blame it totally on human beings. But that's kind of besides the point. So I mean, I don't know if I think we agree on this point, like there'd be evidence against God, things like suffering. And for me, I'm going to have to put in that caveat that conscious life exists. I don't like just saying suffering in itself, because I think that it's going to be, theism does a lot better job explaining conscious life, but that's beside the point. So, I mean, I think we both agree then, like there is some evidence against God and some evidence for God, it seems like.
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely feel so. I feel that way, especially for specific definitions of God. But I just want to make sure everybody knows that for the general theistic God, that's a very basic definition of like a personal God. I don't think that kind of God needs to be omnibenevolent, and he could exist and allow gratuitous suffering. So it all really depends on what definition of God that you're talking about, what definition of God your evidence is trying to either disprove or somehow show that it's not true. It just depends on the definition of God that you're discussing.
Okay, I think that's a good point to leave it. You good if we do a little bit of questions to wrap up?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we have a question from Apologetics Squared, which says, if an asteroid hit the moon and the debris split out, Jesus is Lord in every language, would God's existence be like a required explanation?
I mean, I don't think so, because I don't think that we would be able to rule out like some entity out in the universe doing that. Throwing or hurtling an asteroid in a specific way, and then it ends up spelling all that out. I do agree that that would be an odd formation, especially in the multiple languages, and that would entail some intelligence behind it. But I think that it's kind of a leap in logic to go from that to God, because obviously we're a conscious, intelligent, some people are intelligent species, and we could conceivably do that. You could figure out a way to like pull some kind of magician trick to make it look like an asteroid hit, and then all of that stuff was spelt out. So I disagree with the leap from an intelligent source did this to God is the intelligent source. So I guess where I would stop it would be, so there was some kind of intelligence behind this.
Okay, thanks. We have a question for me from John V, which says that, is it possible that there's the existence of an evil God, one that wants the suffering of creatures instead of their well-being? I would say it's like epistemically possible, so we could at least conceive of an evil God existing. Now, I don't think that it's possible beyond the epistemic, because I think like if we think of God, like I think of God as like a maximally great being, or a being that's purely positive. So there's all things that it's like maybe like better to have than not to have. So like it's better to have like power than no power, knowledge than knowledge, no knowledge, things like that. It seems weird to have like it was also like maximally evil. So you have this purely positive being, all the positives, all the perfections. Then he has like this imperfection of being maximally evil. So it just seems really like weird to me to add that on. And then we could also look at the world. Like I think the world could be a lot worse than it is now. So that's kind of my general thoughts. Obviously, there's like the evil God challenge and things like that to go further. So is there anything you want to comment on here, John?
I mean, I think evil God is probably just as likely as any other definition of God. And I mean, I just would think that you would need evidence to suggest an evil God exists.
Mhm. Okay, thanks. Another question from Squared, which says that if something seems to be true, so for example, like if it seems to us that like there are moral facts that exist, is that seeming some evidence for the proposition being true? I can go first or second. It's up to you.
Oh, you can go right on ahead.
Sure. I would say yes. So, for example, like it seems to me like that there are moral facts. So there'd be some evidence, even if it's not good facts. Maybe you have defeaters like of an evolutionary explanation or something like that. And same things like it seems to me that like other minds exist. So that'd be some evidence for other minds or like for religious experience. I think that can be evidence to like people. Maybe it seems to them that the God exists. So I would say yes, but obviously like if there's defeaters, then it wouldn't be good evidence and things like that. So that's my take on it.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by seems to be true. And the example given, I disagree with. So I don't know if maybe Apologetic Square can come up with a better example, because I don't think that moral facts exist, and especially moral facts independent of a mind. Uh, so I think that's kind of a bad example, but um, I think that if some I think that something can be like, I guess, true in reality, like we all have moral knowledge, that seems to be true. I don't think that that necessarily means any certain proposition is true. I think that sometimes it takes multiple pieces of evidence, and I think that it really kind of depends on what you're trying to prove with whatever evidence you have.
Hmm. Yeah. So maybe I'd say that like I disagreed. Like I have that very strong seeming that there are moral facts. Like so, for example, like if someone like um, did something terrible to my sister, I'm not just gonna say, oh, that's just it's just subjectively wrong. I'd say no, that's just wrong. Like you can't do that. Like I've had that experience with other people where they'll say or do certain things. And I'm like, no, that's just wrong. Like you can't do that. And I have that seeming. Maybe there's some sort of explanation through like an evolutionary mechanism or something like that, but it's still just like I have that seeming, which is some evidence for that proposition. So I mean, that's where I lay. Um, I'm trying to think if there's any more questions relevant to like this kind of debate because I don't want to get too far off topic. So I mean, we talked about like how do you define evidence? Like I said something that makes a proposition more likely to be true. Maybe you just want to reemphasize that, John. What you'd say?
Oh yeah, I mean, I ultimately agree with like what that because I feel like the something that makes a proposition more likely to be true is evident, is an example of good evidence, or what I would consider to be good evidence.
Mm-hmm,
Um, and if it actually makes it more likely to be true, but
mm-hmm,
if it's just some kind of information or data that is used to prove something to be true, in a very generic sense, that would still be evidence. It's a little bit a little bit nuanced on the different uses, I guess, of the word evidence.
mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe it'd be helpful to kind of like as we wrap up here, probably the last question, thinking about like, well, obviously this is going to be very person based, like thinking about justification. So I think about like quantum mechanics, which I know like basically nothing about, but there's a bunch of different theories and like how do we like try to understand like how quantum mechanics works with like the classical world or like how quantum mechanics is involved with or not involved with at all, like consciousness. And there's a bunch of different theories and we don't really know. There's some things that seem to make like certain like ideas about that more likely, but we really just don't know. And obviously like it's going to come into like each person has different views and like based off of like their priors and like our experiences, things like that, they're going to come to different conclusions, and like that's okay. Like we can be rational and holding different views. I think I would say something similar towards as like the existence of God. I don't think it's like 50-50 or anything like that. I think there's really good reason to think God exists, and I'm sure John disagrees with me. But like, we can leave open that like there is just like it's going to be person based. Each person looks at the world differently and thinks about things differently, and we need to recognize the beauty in how we're just like individually different as we like explore these issues.
Well, yeah, I agree with that last part. I would say more specifically, my position is agnostic when it comes to general ideas of God.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm very much a hard atheist when it comes to specific definitions. So
Okay.
I would definitely disagree with you in the context of like Christianity, but I
Mhm.
probably wouldn't disagree. Or well, I would remain agnostic on like the general idea of God as far as whether or not there's good evidence for or against it.
Okay. Well, man, I think this has been a really great conversation, and I've learned a lot just from talking with you, and I'm hoping people listening have done the same. Is there any like last thoughts or things you want to say, John, before we wrap up here?
Just that conversations like we're having between two people that are very, opposed to
Mhm.
opposed in our own general beliefs around this context. I think that we need to start having more of those conversations where we're not looking to just insult and berate each other, but just have good conversations about where we differ. And I think that we accomplish that tonight, on this stream, because while we differ on a good number of things, we actually agree on a good number of things too. And I think that we all just need to realize that there's not a lot of difference between
Mhm.
both sides as far as all of this goes.
Yeah. I think I just like emphasize everything you said there, John, because I agree with it. You and I like it's so important to have these conversations because it's so easy to be tribal and like I'm guilty of it all the time, especially like when we're like texting or whatever. But like having conversations like this help to like humanize people and thinking about like John's a human being, even though I've never like met him in person and like complimented his like, oh, I love your beard in person. Maybe one day. But like it makes it like it's better. Like it's just like it, recognizing people as human beings is just super valuable, and I appreciate that. And like it seems like
Mhm.
like we agree on the nature of evidence. We agree like there's evidence for God. We agree there's evidence against God. And like I'm a theist, John's an atheist. We disagree on a lot of stuff that goes beyond that. But like there's some common agreements, and there's something beautiful about like hashing that out. So yeah, thanks, John.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I always love coming on and talking with you.
Yeah, hopefully I'm sure we'll do something again. But that's it for today. I really hope you found this edible. Everyone that's listening, encourage you to subscribe to my channel if you're new, and subscribe to John's channel. It's added in the YouTube description so you can check it out. And we'll see you next time. So wish you the best, and thank you again for coming on, John.
Thank you.
All right, bye everyone. Have a great night.